Get your damn mouth shut, old lady, or I'll put you down next. The words ripped through the heavy summer air before anyone understood what was happening. Officer Ryan Whitaker's voice cracked with that sharp, reckless anger that always shows up right before something unforgivable. His hand shot forward, snatching the ebony cane from Evelyn Harper's grasp as if it were a weapon. She didn't even have time to breathe, let alone step back, before he shoved her with the full weight of his body. The cane clattered on the sidewalk. Evelyn's skull hit the iron light pole with a hollow, gut-wrenching sound that stopped every conversation within 40 yards. Blood sprayed across the concrete like someone had dropped a jar of ink in the sun. She never screamed. She only gasped, soft and confused, as if trying to understand why a young man with a badge would treat her life like it meant nothing at all. Before going into this story, tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps more than you think. The heat over Atlanta hung like a thick blanket that Sunday at 5:47 p.m., the kind of heat that gathers under your throat and reminds you how heavy the world can feel. Evelyn had just stepped off the church steps after singing in the choir at historic Ebenezer Baptist. Her voice, still warm from the last hymn, felt light in her chest as she laughed with Sister B. Coleman, who had been her friend since the days they carried sandwiches and bandages across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They had been talking about the sermon when they heard the yelling from across the street. Officer Ryan Whitaker, 27, red-faced and trembling with the kind of rage only a man afraid of his own weakness can summon. Had Deshaun Mitchell pinned in place with his voice alone? The boy was 19, slim, terrified, and standing beside a battered Honda with a broken taillight that had probably been cracked since middle school. Whitaker's words were sharp, fast, too loud for a citation. Evelyn's instincts kicked in, the instincts of a nurse who had seen too much blood, too many boys hurt by hands that claimed authority. She lifted her chin and said softly toward him, "Young man, you don't have to talk to him like that." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a reminder of dignity, spoken by a woman who had tended to wounded marchers when police dogs tore into them. But Whitaker heard none of that. All he saw was an older black woman interrupting his moment of power. He moved on her before anyone else could blink. The shove was so sudden that even Sister B froze, eyes wide, lips trembling as if she had felt the impact herself. When Evelyn hit the pole, the sound echoed through her bones. Her body crumpled, folding sideways onto the scorching sidewalk. 98 degrees of heat burned her skin through her choir dress. A small pool of blood spread beneath her head, dark at the center and thin at the edges where it met the concrete. A few people screamed. One man stepped forward, hands shaking, but Whitaker swung his arm outward in a warning gesture, screaming at everyone to stay back. "She shouldn't have interfered," he yelled, voice cracking. His words shook with guilt he didn't yet recognize as guilt. They would replay that moment for him in court one day. But he didn't know that yet. He was still drunk on the arrogance of a badge he never earned. Nurse Tamara Jenkins, who happened to be walking with two colleagues toward her car, clamped a hand over her mouth as she watched Evelyn hit the ground. But her training took over faster than her fear. She sprinted to the scene, phone already recording because instinct and experience told her the truth. Evidence disappears when the wrong hands are in charge of it. She crouched beside Evelyn, her voice low and steady. "Ma'am, stay with me. Just breathe. Just stay with me." Evelyn's eyelids fluttered. Blood seeped into her silver hair. Tamara could feel the heat of the pavement through her scrubs, could hear her co-workers whispering for someone to call EMS. But Whitaker stepped toward them, barking orders, face red and sweat rolling down his temples. "Back up, all of you!" She interfered with an investigation. It was a lie, spoken too fast, too loud, the way all bad lies sound. Tamara didn't move. She pressed 2 fingers to Evelyn's neck and felt a faint, uneven pulse. Her colleagues tugged at her arm, afraid of the officer's rage, but she didn't budge. The minutes that followed felt impossibly slow. 11 minutes passed. 11 long, burning minutes with Evelyn lying on concrete hot enough to blister skin. Whitaker walked in circles like a restless dog, shouting into his radio, trying to justify what everyone had seen. Deshaun Mitchell stood frozen near his car, tears streaking down his cheeks as he whispered, "I didn't mean to cause this." Sister B knelt despite the officer's orders, praying under her breath, "Lord, don't take her. Not like this." The air trembled with a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. No one understood why EMS wasn't arriving faster. No one understood why an elderly woman who had done nothing but speak a sentence of truth was lying unconscious in the sun while an officer paced above her like he was the injured one. When Evelyn stirred at last, her voice was barely a whisper. Tamara leaned in close, brushing blood away from her ear. Evelyn's lips parted. Her voice, thin as thread, carried only one request. "Let me call my boy. Just one call." She tried to lift her hand, but her fingers shook uncontrollably. She didn't know Tamara was filming, didn't know half the city would see those words before sunrise. She only knew the one truth that had carried her through every hardship, every march, every injustice she had witnessed across decades. Her son had never failed her, not once. And in that moment, before her eyes rolled back and her consciousness faded, she trusted that he would come, not with anger, not with violence, but with something far more dangerous to the men who hurt her: memory, truth, and the quiet determination of a son who made a promise long ago that she would never bleed alone again. By the time the ambulance finally arrived, the sidewalk around Evelyn had grown silent. Even Whitaker's voice had fallen to a whisper, as if some part of him understood the line he had crossed. Tamara kept recording until the paramedics lifted Evelyn onto the stretcher. She stayed kneeling on the pavement long after the ambulance doors closed, hands trembling, breath shaking through her teeth. She didn't know the full story. She didn't know who Evelyn's boy was, or what kind of force those whispered words would unleash. She only knew one thing: the world had just shifted, and the men responsible were already running out of time. Marcus Ghost Hale was sitting on the porch of his cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains when the phone beside him vibrated once. Just once. With the soft, familiar tone he had assigned only to his mother. The sun was dropping behind the ridgeline, painting the woods in slow-moving amber light, and the bees from his hives hummed low and lazy around the clover patch near his boots. He had a fresh cup of black coffee cooling on the railing and the quiet kind of evening that men like him rarely get in this lifetime. He picked up the phone expecting a recipe question, or a laugh about some church gossip, or a reminder that he hadn't shaved in a week. Instead, he heard breathing, thin and ragged, followed by a voice he hadn't heard tremble since he was 10 years old. "They hurt me, baby, real bad." The words were faint, as if scraped from the edge of consciousness, and then there was nothing. No scream, no breath, no second sentence, just silence. A silence so sharp it sliced straight into the space behind his ribs. For 12 full seconds, Marcus didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. The world around him fell into a strange stillness, as if even the wind knew better than to touch him. He stared out toward the tree line, jaw clenched, chest rising once and then stopping halfway, like a man holding back the weight of memory. He had heard dying breaths before, too many, but never his mother's. And it was that silence, not the words, that pushed him up from the porch like a force had reached inside his bones and pulled. He slid the phone into his pocket without ending the call, grabbed the keys off the nail by the door, and stepped inside his cabin with the measured calm of a man who has trained his whole life to move without shaking. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. Men like him don't explode. They compress. In the bedroom, he pulled the old go-bag from beneath the cedar chest. It wasn't a bag built for war. Not anymore. But a bag built for truth. Inside was a black Glock 19 he hadn't fired in 7 years, 2 burner phones, a 4-terabyte drive containing 16 years of files he had collected but never used, and a leather-bound diary stained with dried blood from a day most Americans pretend to remember but have never truly understood. Bloody Sunday, 1965. Page 17 still carried a faint brown smear from when his mother, barely an adult, had knelt on the pavement in Selma, pressing her own hand over the wound of a man twice her size. Marcus hesitated as he touched the diary. It had always been his compass, even when he didn't want one. He slipped it into the bag, zipped it shut, and locked his cabin without looking back. 11 minutes after the call, his black F-150 roared down the dirt path, dust rising behind him like a trail of smoke. The sky above the mountains turned purple, then blue, then black as he dropped into the valley and merged onto I-75 south. He kept the windows down, letting the sharp mountain air cut across his face, trying to cool the shaking he refused to acknowledge. He had no plan beyond movement, no thought beyond getting to her bedside. Everything else, justice, truth, reckoning, would come in time, shaped by the same quiet promise he had made to her the day he first wore the sealed trident. You will never bleed alone again. Ma, not as long as I have breath. At 72 miles an hour, he grabbed the burner phone, tapped the single contact labeled Jax. It rang twice. Then a voice came on, low and cautious. Ghost? Thought you were retired for good. Marcus didn't answer the greeting. His voice came out steady, cold enough to freeze the air between them. I need every grave the West Precinct ever dug, every missing body cam, every doctored report, every quiet payout, all of it. Jax exhaled a slow whistle. Atlanta? Marcus nodded once, eyes fixed on the highway. Yeah, Atlanta. There was no need for explanation. Jax had served with him long enough to know that Marcus never asked for information unless someone's life depended on it. And he had never, not once, asked for this kind of information before. Jax didn't ask who got hurt. He didn't ask why. He only said, "Give me 2 hours. I'll pull the cloud, the backups, and the off-books drives. You'll have a full set before dawn." Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. "This won't be a fight," he said quietly. "It'll be a truth." Jax paused on the other end, voice lowering. Ghost. Truth hurts worse than bullets in the wrong hands. The line clicked silent. Marcus threw the burner onto the passenger seat and focused only on the road ahead. Miles rolled beneath him in long, silent waves. He passed through winding stretches of highway where the woods pressed close, then through small towns lit by flickering gas station signs, then back into darkness where even the moon seemed to hold its breath. He thought of his mother lying somewhere in Atlanta, small and frail on a hospital bed, blood drying in her hair. He thought of the boys she had patched up on church steps, in back alley clinics, and on the streets of Alabama. He thought of all the times she had lifted him up when the weight of the world had pushed him down. And by the second hour of the drive, he had already decided something he would never say out loud. If she died, no one responsible would sleep in peace again, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with truth so sharp it would carve the rot from their bones. When midnight hit, Jax sent the first file, then another, then 20 more. Marcus listened to the chime of each notification like they were footsteps approaching in the dark. Body cam failures, missing reports, internal complaints buried in the system, excessive force files lost to clerical error. He forwarded everything to the backup drive in his go bag, imprinting each piece of information into the part of his mind that never forgot anything. As he crossed into the Georgia state line, he picked up the second burner, dialed a different number, and waited. A woman answered, calm, steady, familiar. "This is Torres." Marcus exhaled once. "Captain, I need you in Atlanta." A quiet pause. Then her voice sharpened. "What happened?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "They hurt my mother." She breathed in slowly. "I'll be there before sunrise." The sky was still black when the city lights of Atlanta appeared on the horizon. Marcus rolled his shoulders back, cracked his neck, and prepared himself for the truth he was about to face. He didn't know what Evelyn looked like in the hospital yet. He didn't know the damage done. He didn't know how many men had helped cover it up, but he knew the one thing that mattered. His mother had made one call, and now he was here. A ghost walking into a city that had no idea its quietest truth was already on its way to their doors. At 2:14 a.m., the sliding doors of Grady Memorial's trauma bay hissed open as Marcus stepped inside. Still wearing the dust of the mountains on his shirt and the weight of 30 years of memory on his shoulders. The smell of antiseptic, metal, and old fear wrapped around him like a familiar shadow. He had walked into trauma rooms before, some with teammates missing limbs, some with boys half his age gasping their last breaths. But nothing prepared him for this hallway. Nothing prepared him for the sight of his mother's name scrawled in red across the intake board. Harper, Evelyn, critical. He moved down the hallway like a man walking underwater, slow and deliberate, absorbing every sound, the clicking of heels, the low hum of machines, the distant beeping that broke the silence like a heartbeat out of rhythm. A nurse looked up at him, recognized the same expression she had seen on soldiers coming in from the worst battlefields, and simply pointed toward Trauma Room 3 without asking a question. When he stepped inside, the world shrank to a single point: his mother. Evelyn lay beneath a sheet that rose and fell in shallow waves. A rigid cervical collar held her neck in place. Dried blood matted her hair at the base of her skull. A thin line of oxygen tubing traced across her cheeks, and the monitors beside her bed pulsed in small green flickers, each one marking the narrow distance between life and something colder. A surgeon murmured terms he knew all too well: subdural hematoma, midline shift, 50-50. But Marcus barely heard them. He sat in the chair beside the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, and looked at her face. For the first time since leaving the mountains, his breath wavered. He reached out with careful fingers and brushed the back of her hand, the skin still warm, still alive. A whisper rose from his chest, not meant for anyone else. "I'm here. Ma. I'm right here." He reached into his go bag and pulled out the leather diary he had carried across oceans, deserts, and battlefields. The bloodstain on page 17 had darkened over the years, but the words remained clear. Silence is also violence. He traced those words with his thumb and felt the weight of them settle across his spine. His mother had written them 50 years before he ever became a SEAL. 50 years before he ever held a rifle in a place where miles away meant nothing. She had written them after bandaging strangers on a bridge drenched in gas and blood. And now she lay before him, hurt by a young cop who had never learned the lessons she tried to pass on to the world. Marcus opened the diary and let his eyes move across the old ink. He read the passage she had written after Selma, the one where she described how a man twice her size had collapsed into her arms, coughing blood onto her skirt, whispering, "Don't let them say I didn't stand." She wrote that she carried the weight of that moment for decades, not as a burden, but as a promise to the next generation. He felt the words tighten around his chest. He thought of all the men he had served with, all the brothers he had lost, all the pain he had buried so deep that nothing could touch it. Until now. For the first time in 19 deployments, Marcus let tears fall, not loud, not broken, just quiet, steady drops that hit the diary like the soft taps of distant rain. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the back of her hand, his voice a low whisper that trembled against the cold metal rails. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I should have been closer. I should have known." He wasn't a man given to regret, but regret had come anyway. Settling in the spaces between his words, he inhaled her scent, faint lavender, hospital antiseptic, and the memory of Sunday mornings, and felt a shift inside him like a door opening to a room he hadn't entered in years. A room where he wasn't the ghost, wasn't the soldier, wasn't the man who had disappeared into the mountains to avoid losing any more people he loved. In this room, he was just her boy. He didn't notice the soft footsteps at first. Nurse Tamara Jenkins stood at the doorway, holding a small USB drive in her palm like it was something holy. Her eyes were rimmed red, exhaustion written across her face, but her voice stayed steady. "Mr. Hale?" He lifted his head, wiped nothing from his eyes, and turned toward her. She stepped inside, closed the door quietly behind her, and held the drive out with both hands. "This is the full video," she said softly. "I recorded everything. I couldn't let them bury it." Her voice cracked on the last word. Marcus stood, took the drive from her gently, and studied her face. She had the look of someone who had crossed an invisible line, someone who had decided she was willing to lose her job, her safety, maybe even her future, for the truth. He nodded once, a silent recognition of courage. "You just saved more than your job," he said. His tone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was something deeper. An acknowledgement that her action had already changed the course of what came next. Tamara exhaled a shaky breath, relieved by something she couldn't name. "Your mother. She was trying to help that boy. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't interfering. She just asked him to talk respectfully. That's all." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. When he opened them, his gaze held a clarity that made Tamara's skin prickle. A clarity sharpened by grief, sharpened by memory, sharpened by something inside him, waking up after years of silence. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing your ground." She nodded once, her throat tight, then slipped out of the room before her emotions betrayed her. Marcus plugged the USB into his laptop. The screen lit up with the shaky, breathless footage of the sidewalk outside Ebenezer Baptist. He watched the moment his mother stepped forward. He watched Whitaker's hand snatch her cane. He watched the shove, the impact, the blood, the stillness. And then he heard her final words before the world went dark. "Let me call my boy." Something in him tightened, like a rope pulled too far. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something precise. He let the video play again and again. He memorized every angle, every shadow, every voice in the background. He listened to Whitaker shouting lies. He listened to the silence of the officers who stood by and did nothing. He watched Deshawn's panic. He watched Sister B kneel despite being ordered away. Each replay carved another layer of understanding into him, shaping the path ahead. By the time he shut the laptop, dawn was still hours away, but his purpose was clear. He stood beside his mother's bed, placed the diary gently on her chest, and whispered, "You taught me that silence is violence, so I won't be silent." He brushed her forehead with the back of his fingers. Soft, tender, deliberate. "Rest for now, Ma. I'll take it from here." And with that, Marcus Ghost Hale stepped out of the trauma bay, leaving behind the boy she raised and becoming once again the man the world hoped never to see. By sunrise the next morning, the machinery of truth had already begun turning in places the men of the West Precinct never thought to look. At 5:12 a.m., a Delta red-eye from Washington, D.C., touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson, and Captain Elena Torres stepped onto the jet bridge with the calm, measured stride of a woman who had spent years defending soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Her hair was tied back in a tight bun, her suit jacket pressed, and in her hand was a locked silver attaché case holding 9 classified excessive force files that had been reported missing from the DoD archives. Files she had personally pulled from a restricted vault after Marcus called her with the kind of voice she had only heard once before. The night she saved him from a court-martial that would have ended his life. She moved through the airport without a pause, her badge tucked just low enough to avoid attention and just visible enough to deter questions. She knew she was stepping into the kind of mess that had career ending written all over it, but her loyalty to Marcus wasn't built on politics. It was built on something older, mutual survival. At the same hour, Jax Rivera, operating from a secure desk in a rented storage unit 2 miles from the Beltline, began cutting through the Atlanta Police Department's cloud server like a man removing rotten walls from a condemned house. His fingers moved fast over the keyboard, every keystroke sending a quiet pulse into the system. Firewalls, decoys, redundancy loops. It didn't matter. Jax had once slipped into an Iranian black site network without leaving a single fingerprint. Compared to that, APD's security felt like it had been built out of duct tape and wishful thinking. Within minutes, he found the first inconsistency. A 33-second gap in Officer Ryan Whitaker's body cam footage, time-stamped 43 seconds before Evelyn Harper hit the light pole. A deliberate disablement, masked as a battery fault, then manually edited by Sergeant Victor Kane's credentials 3 hours after the incident. Jax leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes, whispering under his breath. There it is. He tunneled deeper. Missing complaint forms. Anonymous civilian reports rerouted into unauthorized folders. A side channel used to scrub internal affairs reviews. And then the jackpot. Deputy Chief Malcolm Reed's private financial ledger buried beneath layers of encryption so outdated Jax bypassed it with a program he wrote in Afghanistan 12 years earlier. When the ledger opened, the numbers jumped off the screen. Offshore deposits, union hush money, legal defense contributions. A total of $35,000 funneled quietly into Reed's personal accounts over the last 9 years, all tied to cases marked unsubstantiated. Jax sat up straighter. Reed's dirty. He whispered, filthy dirty. He forwarded the files to Marcus, adding only 1 line of text. This isn't corruption. This is architecture. At 7:10 a.m., Elena Torres walked into Grady Memorial Hospital, past the security desk with a quiet nod, and found Marcus in the family waiting lounge with his hands clasped, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor like a man thinking 10 years into the future. She sat beside him without speaking. He didn't look up for nearly a minute. When he finally did, his voice was steady. You came. Elena rested a hand on his arm. You called. She said, that was enough. He nodded once, the kind of nod soldiers give each other when words feel like excess weight. Then he reached into his bag, pulled out the USB Tamara had given him, and placed it in her hand. This is what they did. Elena plugged it into her tablet. She watched the shove, the impact, the blood, the stillness, the way Whitaker barked orders at terrified witnesses. She didn't blink. When the video ended, she inhaled slowly, unclenched her jaw, and whispered, this wasn't an accident. This was a pattern. Marcus slid a thick stack of printouts across the table, files Jax had sent overnight. It goes deeper, he said, and it's not just Whitaker. Elena scanned the documents, her eyes narrowing. Reed, Kane, Brooks, and God knows who else. At 8:30 a.m., inside the quiet sanctuary of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Reverend Naomi Whitfield called an emergency meeting with community leaders, choir members, and elders who had watched Evelyn grow up, raise her son, bury her husband, and nurse half the congregation through everything from broken bones to broken hearts. The church carried a sacred stillness that morning, the kind that settled over the pews like a blanket. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows in soft reds and golds, casting a warm glow across the faces of men and women who had marched, prayed, fought, and voted through decades of struggle. Reverend Naomi stood at the pulpit, her voice steady, her eyes bright with quiet fury. "We don't need another riot," she said, her tone carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen too many cities burn without rising stronger afterward. "We need a funeral for their lies. We need truth that doesn't break. We need to show them that we see everything now." The congregation murmured in agreement. Sister B. Coleman stood, her hands trembling. "They almost killed Evelyn," she said. "And for what? Because she spoke like a mother to a child?" Naomi stepped down from the pulpit, placing a hand over B's. "We will carry her voice," she said gently, "and we will carry the truth." She turned back to the room. "Tonight, we meet at Woodruff Park. We stand in silence, no shouting, no fists, no anger, just the weight of truth. Let the city feel it." By 9:15 a.m., Marcus and Elena moved their operation to a small, unused conference room in the hospital's lower wing. Jax joined them through a secure video feed, his face illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors. Elena spread the recovered files across the table: body cam failures, missing reports, evidence tampering logs, forged signatures. "We have enough to blow open 9 cases, she said quietly. Jax nodded. "And that's just from the surface layer? I haven't even touched the off-site backups yet." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We're not rushing this," he said. "We gather everything. We map the network. We show the city the truth all at once." Elena met his gaze. "That's a dangerous plan," she warned. "They'll panic." Marcus shook his head. "Good. Panic makes men sloppy." Jax cracked a faint, humorless smile. "The old ghost is back." At noon, while the city sweltered under 97 degrees of summer heat, Marcus stepped outside to clear his mind. He walked to the edge of the hospital courtyard where the noise of traffic faded just enough to think. He could feel the storm gathering, one built not of rage, but of evidence, patience, and memory. A storm his mother had unknowingly started the moment she whispered her final request on that hot Atlanta sidewalk. "Let me call my boy." He closed his eyes, letting her voice settle inside him like a vow. When he opened them again, his path was clear. By evening, the pieces were in motion. Jax cracked 3 more servers. Elena finished compiling the 9 lost cases. Reverend Naomi prepared for the gathering at Woodruff Park, and in the quiet room where Evelyn lay. The monitors hummed a fragile rhythm that kept Marcus grounded, kept him steady, kept him sharp. The truth was coming, and every man who had tried to bury it was about to learn that silence, once broken, becomes the loudest force in the world. By day 3, the hospital room had settled into a rhythm of quiet monitoring, soft footsteps, and the constant hum of machines that seemed to breathe for Evelyn when her own body could not. Morning sunlight pushed through the blinds in thin, warm lines, brushing across the foot of her bed as if reminding her that the world still waited for her to wake fully. Marcus sat in the same chair he had barely left since arriving, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together, eyes fixed on the woman who had carried him through every storm of his life. The diary still lay on the bedside table. Open to the page she bled on in Selma, its words resting like a steady heartbeat. When Evelyn's eyes flickered open for the first true time since the fall, Marcus's breath caught in his chest. She looked at him, not with the full clarity she once carried, but with a fragile awareness. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He leaned closer, smoothing her hair with a gentle hand. "I came home. Ma," he whispered. Her fingers moved weakly toward his. He held them, steady and warm. For a long moment, neither spoke. Yet everything was said. She was alive, and he would not leave her side. A soft knock broke the silence. Nurse Tamara stepped in, adjusting Evelyn's monitors with practiced hands. "She's stable for now," she said quietly. "She'll need rest and time." Marcus nodded. Time was something he understood better than most. How to stretch it, how to use it, how to let it sharpen into something that could cut through lies. He stood, kissed his mother's forehead, and stepped into the hallway. Elena Torres waited outside with a folder tucked under her arm, her expression controlled but tense. "We have movement," she said, "and trouble." Marcus followed her to the small conference room where Jax appeared on the screen. "Ghost," Jax said without preamble. "Kane's panicking, Reed's trying to clean his accounts, and Brooks. Brooks is making phone calls to the mayor's office." Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. "They're circling the wagons," Elena added. "Brooks scheduled a visit to the hospital. Public relations. He wants a photo shaking your hand." Marcus paused, letting the weight of that settle. "Let him come," he said. At 11:43 a.m., Captain Harlan Brooks arrived outside Evelyn's room with a bouquet that still had the $9.99 price tag hanging from the cellophane. His uniform was pressed to perfection, but the nervous sweat at his temples betrayed the fear beneath the fabric. He rehearsed a sympathetic smile in the reflection of the door window, then stepped inside as if entering a stage he had paid for. "Mr. Hale," he began, voice coated in practiced sorrow. "I just wanted to express my deepest regrets for this unfortunate incident." He placed the bouquet at the foot of Evelyn's bed with the care of a man who thought flowers could erase violence. Marcus remained standing, arms crossed, watching him with an expression so calm it unsettled the captain more than anger would have. Brooks cleared his throat and continued. "We are forming a review committee. We will issue a public statement. Officer Whitaker has been placed on temporary desk duty pending." Marcus cut him off quietly. "Suspend Whitaker." His tone held no edge, no aggression, only certainty. Brooks blinked. "Well, we will naturally consider." Marcus stepped closer, his voice settling into a steady, unyielding rhythm. 72 hours. Suspend him. Reopen all 9 cases Jax pulled from your department's dark files, or I make sure your name dies before you do. Brooks let out a small laugh. Thin, brittle, defensive. "You're threatening a police captain?" Marcus tilted his head slightly. "No," he said softly. "I'm giving you a chance." Brooks looked around the room as if searching for an ally. Evelyn lay motionless. The machines beeped softly. The sunlight drifted across the sheets. And in that quiet, something in Brooks cracked. He straightened, tightened his jaw, and tried to reclaim authority. "Mr. Hale," he said, "you don't understand how the system works." Marcus stepped closer still, close enough that Brooks could see the reflection of his own fear in Marcus's eyes. "You're not safe anymore either," Marcus said. "Not because of me, because of truth. And truth is coming for all 4 of you." Brooks swallowed hard, his facade slipping like wet paper. He backed toward the door, mumbling something about policy and procedure, but the words meant nothing now. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Outside the room, Brooks leaned against the wall, rubbing his hands together nervously. He didn't know how much Marcus already had. He didn't know how much worse it would get by nightfall. But he knew, deep down, that he had just stood inches from a man who did not bluff, a man who didn't need weapons to break a system already rotting from within. Marcus returned to his mother's bedside. Her eyes were open again, watching him with a weak but knowing expression. She tried to mouth a word, careful, but the sound never formed. He sat beside her, taking her hand gently. "I know," he said softly. "I know what I'm walking into." He brushed a thumb across her wrist, feeling her pulse faint but steady. "But you taught me a long time ago that standing back is how these men keep winning." She blinked slowly, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. Marcus leaned in. "Rest. That's your job now." As afternoon turned to evening, Elena and Jax fed Marcus a steady stream of updates. Kane had been seen entering a warehouse downtown rumored to hold seized evidence. Reed had transferred funds to a Cayman account 2 hours earlier. Brooks had left the hospital, likely to consult department lawyers. The network was fraying, each man pulling in a different direction to save himself. Marcus listened, absorbing each detail, letting it settle into the blueprint forming in his mind. "We hold until the leak," he said. Elena nodded. Jax grinned. "Then we light the match." Back inside the trauma ward, the night shift arrived. Nurses whispered about Evelyn's condition. Doctors reviewed scans. And Marcus sat beside his mother again, reading quietly from her diary, letting his voice fill the room with memories of the bridge she crossed and the men she saved. He read until her eyes closed, until her body settled into a peaceful rhythm, until the chaos of the city felt distant enough to breathe. But Marcus knew the peace wouldn't last. He knew what tomorrow would bring, the unraveling, the exposure, the reckoning. And as he watched his mother sleep, he felt the weight of the promise she had carried across decades settle onto his own shoulders. A promise that would shape the next 48 hours of Atlanta's history. In that quiet room, under soft hospital lights, Marcus Ghost Hale prepared himself for the moment when truth would no longer be whispered in the dark, but shown to the world, undeniable and unforgiving. Night 4 arrived with a strange, uneasy stillness over Atlanta, the kind that usually settles before a storm. Except this storm wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from a quiet hospital room, a storage unit lit by 2 monitors, and a pastor who refused to let fear make her small. At 3:15 a.m., while most of the city slept, Marcus Ghost Hale sat at a narrow desk lit only by a single overhead lamp. His eyes didn't blink. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he uploaded the final files Jax had decrypted, body cam videos buried for years, forged use-of-force reports, internal affairs memos rewritten 3 times, Deputy Chief Reed's offshore transfers, Kane's intimidation tactics, Brooks's election season cover-ups, 9 victims whose names had never made the news, the full architecture of corruption, laid bare when the last file locked into place. Marcus clicked a single key. The screen pulsed once, then opened a blank, white page with black text at the top, onecall.truth. No ads, no comments, no tracking, just truth, clean, unvarnished, undeniable. He exhaled through his nose, calm and cold. Let them see. He whispered, across Atlanta. The website detonated like a silent bomb. Phones lit up in bedrooms, laptops pinged in apartments above Auburn Avenue. Screens glowed in taxis waiting near 5 Points. Officers in West Precinct opened their inboxes to dozens of frantic messages. Journalists jolted awake to alerts flashing urgent, unreleased body cam footage. And on social media, the link traveled with the speed of outrage, shared from one shaking hand to another until it became a river no one could dam. By 5:40 a.m., thousands of Atlantans were standing silently outside West Precinct. No signs, no chants, no yelling, just stillness. Mothers with their children, elders with walking canes, students in hoodies, veterans with medals pinned to their shirts, people holding photos of Evelyn Harper, and photos of 9 others whose names the city had never bothered to say out loud. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They simply stood, an unbroken line of eyes staring at a building that had hidden too much for too long. Reverend Naomi Whitfield stepped to the front of the crowd, her Bible pressed to her chest, her voice quiet but strong enough to carry across the morning air. "We're not here to burn the city," she said. "We're here to bury the lies that poisoned it," the crowd murmured, steady and reverent. She lifted her gaze toward the precinct windows. Let the truth speak. Let justice breathe. And let the men who did this face the weight of what they tried to bury. Behind her. The sun began to rise, casting a golden line across the pavement as if the day itself wanted to witness what came next. Inside the precinct. Sergeant Victor Kane stared out the window with trembling hands. He had once been a good officer, 22 years ago, before the job carved pieces out of him one by one until he couldn't recognize himself anymore. He saw the crowd. Then he saw something he didn't expect, an elderly woman near the front, leaning on a cane, looking directly at him, not with anger, not with judgment, with disappointment. She reminded him too much of his mother, the same strength in the spine, the same fire in the eyes. His throat tightened, and then another voice echoed in his memory, his mother screaming in 1969 as officers shoved her against a sidewalk during a voting protest. Kane's knees buckled. He gripped the window frame, breath shaking. "Victor," a young officer whispered behind him. "What do we do?" Kane didn't answer. He stepped away from the window, walked through the front doors, and into the sunlight. The crowd parted, confused. The 82-year-old woman stepped forward and said softly, "Victor, you forgot how they beat your mama in '69? The words hit him like a blow. His breath broke, his eyes filled, and right there. In front of the precinct, he had served for more than 2 decades. Sergeant Victor Kane dropped to his knees and wept like a man collapsing under the full truth of his own choices. But while the city held its breath around Kane's collapse, a different scene unfolded in a dark corner of the precinct parking lot. Officer Ryan Whitaker sat alone in the driver's seat of his patrol car, hands shaking violently. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken to anyone except the union rep who told him to deny everything until things calmed down. But things hadn't calmed down. They had exploded. Every screen in America had now seen the video of him shoving a 68-year-old woman hard enough to crack her skull. Every buried file involving him, every complaint, every excessive force case, every racial slur he thought no one heard, was now public. And with each passing minute, the walls of his life collapsed a little more. Sweat trickled down his brow. His breath came short, fast, panicked. His fingers slipped toward the holster on his thigh, as if pulled by something dark and broken inside him. He pulled the weapon free, pressed the cold barrel against his mouth, and shut his eyes. The pressure of years of arrogance, fear, violence, and shame swallowed him whole. A moment later, a muffled shot echoed through the parking lot. He didn't die, but when officers broke the window to pull him out, he no longer resembled a man. Whitaker survived the blast, but would spend the rest of his life trapped inside the muted, empty fog of a vegetative state, back at Grady Memorial. Marcus watched the news coverage on a small wall-mounted television. Silent crowds. Naomi praying, Kane on his knees, Whitaker being loaded into an ambulance with an officer's jacket covering his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't celebrate. He didn't grieve. He simply turned off the TV and sat beside his mother again. "It's starting, Ma," he whispered softly. "Not revenge. Truth." Evelyn's fingers twitched, barely perceptible. It was the only sign she heard him. Meanwhile, Jax continued feeding the website with backup files, internal emails, precinct whiteboard photos, evidence logs. No turning back now. He muttered. Elena Torres stood beside him, hands on her hips, watching everything unfold with the calm concentration of a military strategist. Good, she said. The city needed this. By mid-afternoon, Woodruff Park overflowed with people standing shoulder to shoulder in complete silence. Every race, every age, every neighborhood. No signs, no shouting, just eyes. Thousands of eyes locked on the truth. A truth Evelyn Harper had ignited with 4 trembling words. Let me call my boy. And as night fell over Atlanta, the men who had built their careers on buried files, forged reports, and stolen justice finally realized the truth. They were no longer hiding from a man. They were hiding from a city that had finally awakened. By the dawn of the 10th day, the city of Atlanta no longer resembled the place it had been when Evelyn Harper first hit the pavement. The streets felt heavier, quieter, as if the air itself carried the memory of the truth that had spilled across every screen in the country. West Precinct stood half empty, its windows dark, its parking lot littered with abandoned patrol cars from officers who chose to call in sick, unavailable, or off duty until further notice. Inside Grady Memorial, Marcus sat at the foot of his mother's bed, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest, listening to the steady beep of the monitor that had become a kind of heartbeat for them both. The war had never been his intention, but sometimes the truth moves through a city the way rain moves through dry earth, slow at first, then unstoppable. And the truth had reached every corner now, leaving only consequences behind. The first came for Ryan Whitaker. The trial lasted only 8 days. Not a long trial, not a complicated one. The prosecution played the 38-second video. They played the missing body cam timestamp. They played the 9 previous complaints he thought he'd buried under favors from Reed and Brooks, his father, a powerful state senator, sat in the front row with a face hard enough to crack glass. The jury deliberated exactly 36 minutes, 12 years in state prison, no parole. The sentence would have meant something different if Whitaker had still been a whole man. But inside the facility, 14 months later, 2 inmates dragged him into a shower and beat him until his brain shut down for the second and final time. He didn't die, but whatever was left of him remained locked inside a body that no longer followed commands. A permanent resident of a long-term care wing where no one visited and nurses whispered prayers over him out of habit. Not hope. Sergeant Victor Kane faced his reckoning next, not in a courtroom, but in the quiet moments after he broke down on the precinct steps. He cooperated fully. He turned over files no one else knew existed. He handed Elena Torres a notebook filled with dates, transfers, and instructions from Reed that tied the entire network together. His testimony destroyed Reed's last defense, but truth has a cost. Kane lost his pension, lost his marriage, lost the respect of the son who wouldn't pick up the phone. He moved into a one-room trailer near the Alabama border, where he sat on the small porch each night listening to cicadas and the faint echo of his mother's voice saying, "You were supposed to be better." Some nights he cried, some nights he drank, and some nights he stared at the sky and whispered apologies no one would ever hear. He wasn't evil, just a man who broke in slow, silent pieces until someone else paid the price. Now he lived with the pieces. Captain Harlan Brooks fell next. When the mayor demanded his resignation, he tried to spin a statement about unforeseen leadership failures, but the truth was already too loud for spin. His wife filed for divorce 2 days later. His daughters changed their last name before the ink was dry. His pension was cut in half after the federal inquiry found he had knowingly suppressed multiple excessive force complaints. The election he once dreamed of vanished like smoke in wind. By the time fall rolled in, he was working as a mall security guard at South Lake, walking slow circles past food courts and outlet stores, flinching every time a black teenager made eye contact with him for the rest of his life. He carried one private fear, that one day someone would recognize him, not as a captain, not as a leader, but as the man who tried to hide the truth and failed. And then came Deputy Chief Malcolm Reed, the shadow behind the curtain. Agents raided his home at 4:17 a.m., pulling $2.7 million in cash from the walls, floors, and air vents. Offshore ledgers tied him directly to the union hush money, the tampered evidence logs, and 9 civil cases he had helped suppress. The federal judge didn't flinch when she read the sentence: 28 years in a supermax facility with no possibility of early release. Reed walked into prison with his chin raised, carrying himself like a man who still believed he could bargain his way out. But inside that concrete labyrinth, surrounded by white supremacist inmates who recognized his name from the leak, he discovered how fragile arrogance becomes when walls close in. They found him in the shower 18 months later. No witnesses, no camera angle, just a broken man who spent a lifetime selling silence and died alone in it. While the city watched the last of the 4 men fall, Grady Memorial Hospital carried a different kind of energy, quieter, gentler, filled with hope that had grown slowly over days of uncertainty. On a warm Sunday morning, Evelyn Harper opened her eyes fully for the first time since the fall. Marcus was there before the nurses could even call his name. She looked at him with clarity, weak but focused, and squeezed his hand. Her voice was soft, rasped, trembling. "You came home." Marcus leaned forward, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Always." He whispered, "Always." "Ma." Word spread quickly. By the time Reverend Naomi arrived, followed by Sister B, followed by Tamara and half the music ministry. The hallway filled with people holding paper fans and quiet prayers, when the doctors confirmed she could walk again with therapy. The city felt the news like a long breath after holding air too long. 3 weeks later, Evelyn stepped back into the sanctuary of Ebenezer Baptist, leaning on her cane, moving slowly but proudly. The church was packed, balcony, pews, aisles. When she appeared at the doorway, the entire congregation rose to its feet. They clapped, they cried, they praised, and the sound of it rolled through the building like a tide of victory. 7 full minutes passed before the room settled enough for the choir to begin the hymn her voice usually led. She sat gently, tearful but smiling, as Reverend Naomi took her hand and whispered, "The city stood for you, and because of you." Marcus stayed beside her that entire service. He kept his hand on hers, steady and warm, letting her lean on him as she sang the final chorus in a soft, trembling voice. And when it ended, when the crowd embraced her, when the city she loved wrapped her in gratitude, Marcus stepped back and watched with a quiet ache of relief. A week later, after she returned home with a walker and a smile soft as morning light, Marcus packed his go-bag again. He kissed her forehead. He promised he would visit once a month with fresh honey from the mountains. She nodded, eyes filled with trust. "Go home, baby," she whispered. "You've carried enough." He walked out to his truck, looked once more at the city skyline, and felt the weight of his promise settle back into place. Not heavy, not painful, just part of who he was. Then he drove north, back toward the quiet cabin, the bees, and a life built far away from the noise of cities. He didn't leave because he was running. He left because the truth had done its work. The 4 men responsible had paid their price. The city had woken. His mother had healed. And the boy she called in her darkest moment had kept his word. One call had changed everything. And Marcus Ghost Hale returned to the mountains, knowing that sometimes justice doesn't come from rage or violence. Sometimes it comes from truth whispered softly, and heard by a city finally ready to listen. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps me bring you more powerful stories just like this one.